This is a basic backend API project using Python. We're going to be using Flask and its extension Flask-RESTful. Now this isn't used so much anymore, I don't think. It is quite an older project, but there's a few things that I really liked about it, notably the resourceful routing, which basically means we create a class as our handler, we assign it to an endpoint, and we use our functions under it with the HTTP verbs to decide what happens when that endpoint is here. I quite like this approach. It's a bit different, so let's get started. I have my project open here. This is Fleet, a new editor from JetBrains. You can try it out for free. So far, seems pretty good. I have my virtual environment set up and running. You definitely need to do that. And I've pip installed Flask-RESTful, which brings Flask along with it, and also Pony ORM to manage our database. So let's get our imports out the way first. So we'll do from Flask. We're going to import. We're going to need Flask because this is essentially a Flask app. And we're also going to need requests. So I'm going to import this in now and I'll show you where we're going to use it later. Then from Flask-RESTful, we're going to import in our resource, which was the classes that I just showed you, and also API, so we can actually create an API and attach it to our application. The final thing is from Pony, we're going to import ORM. It's up to you which ORM you use if you have a preference. I've just been using Pony for small projects like this recently because it's super simple. So we have a few things to do now. We need to actually instantiate our app, our API, and our database instance. So I'm just going to do that quickly. So app, Flask, and I always do the _name here. And this is basically going to mean that this is now going to be matching our file name here. Then we can do our API is equal to the API, which is what we've imported from Flask-RESTful, and attach it to our app. And finally, DB is going to be ORM.database. With these now set up, we want to actually sort of think about what we want to save into our database. Now, this API, I'm going to say we're going to save game data, so whatever kind of sports scores or something like that. So we need to have a class for that. So we'll say class, and I'm going to call this game. And I'm going to say that this is an entity into our database. So this is coming from Pony here. We're going to have 5 different fields. So Pony will automatically create a primary key for us, but we're going to have a game ID as well that we want it to be unique. So I'm going to say game ID is equal to ORM.required because we want this field to actually be a requirement. And we're going to say this is going to be a string and it needs to be unique. And we're doing this so we can handle trying to add the same thing to the database multiple times, which we don't want to do. Then we'll have our home team, which is going to be again ORM.required, and this is just a string. Then we're going to have the away team, so I'll just copy that line down here. Same deal, and then we'll have the home score, which will be again required because there has to be a score for the game to have completed. And again, also here. So this is a very, very simple database. Notice I'm using int for the scores there. Now you could put these all in separate files, and if you were building a bigger project, you absolutely would do that. But when you're starting small, don't worry about abstracting everything out until you get to the point where you really need to. Our API is going to have basically 2 resources, 2 endpoints, and 1 model. So I don't know why we wouldn't put this all in one file. It's barely going to be 100 lines long. What we need to do now is just finish off some of the database stuff. We need to do db.bind, and we're going to say the provider is going to be equal to SQLite. Don't be afraid to use SQLite for all your small projects. It's absolutely fine. File name is going to be equal to, and we'll just call this one database.sqlite. And then we want to have the create db is equal to true. What this means is that when this line runs, if this file doesn't exist, it will create it for us. Then we just need to do db.generate the mapping, which is going to basically say these are the tables that we want, and we're going to do create tables is equal to true. This line is basically going to grab all of our entities, all of our databases, and going to create a table, all of the database entities, and it's going to create a table for us there. So now that we've got the database stuff out of the way, we can think about our API down here. So as we talked about at the beginning, we're going to create resource classes as our handlers and then set them to certain endpoints. So I'm going to say the first one that I'm going to have is game list. This resource, which is what I showed you at the beginning, it's going to have a get and a post function attached to it. So we'll do get, and this should be self. And I'm just going to do pass here first, just so we can scaffold this out a bit neater. And then we'll say our post, and again, self, and pass here now. So what this basically means is that when we get to the URL that's attached to this resource, if it's a get request, it's going to run this code. If it's a post request, it will run this code. We are going to have another one as well. We'll have a detail one, so we'll call this one game detail. Again, this is a resource, and we're just going to have get here. So I'm just going to do def get, and this would be self, and then pass. So this one's going to take in the game ID that we give it, and it's going to find that entry in the database and then return that data back to us. So what we're going to do now is we're going to add the resources. So we do api.addResource. The first one is going to be game list, and we're going to just attach it to the root URL. So what we're saying is our root URL is now going to handle all of this. Our handle, or rather the other way around, this handler is going to handle for the root URL endpoint there. I'm going to add another one, and we're going to call it game detail. There we go. Now we want to say we're going to give it the game ID. Now this is a string, so I'm going to say this has to be a string, because otherwise we're not going to get anything. And we're going to call it game ID. So this is the part that comes after the URL, so we can query that specific information. So to run this, we'll just do if name is equal to main like this, and then we do app.run, and it will be debug. We want true, so we can do all that stuff, and port is equal to 555. That will work fine. So let's test this. We'll do Python 3 main.py. We can see that this is all up and running. There's nothing in our database or in our roots at the moment, so we won't get anything back in our browser. But we can see here that it is up and running. And it's created our database here. Now, if you were to open this in a database manager, you'd see the table here that matched this information. So let's think about creating some information first. So let's do this post part first. Now, when we post information, we're going to be sending to our API JSON data. So we need to access that JSON, and that's where our request came in. So we'll do new game is equal to the request.json. Now this is from Flask, and this is what I create. This is what I imported this one for here. This is going to give us access to that information. Now to store it in the database, we need to use the ORMDB session. This is going to be a context manager, so it will handle the closing and the opening of the connections to the database for us. So let's do with orm.db session, there it is. We now have access to this stuff in here. We want to create an instance of the game model. So we'll do game, and then we need to fill in all of the information that we need to handle here, that we need to give it. So we need, each one of these needs to actually be passed in, which is all going to come from the request that we post. So we'll say game ID is going to be equal to new game, and we're going to access the game ID key from that JSON data that we post. This is important because we're going to be posting JSON and we're going to be accessing this key. So if the JSON doesn't match, it's going to fail. So let's do home team. Let's fill the rest of this in. New game and home team. I'm going to call the keys exactly the same just so it's clear. Away team, new game, away team, and home score, new game, home score, and then the same for away score, like this. So all we're doing is we are taking, I don't know why that one's, so what we're doing is we're taking the information, the JSON from the request, and we're translating it into our game object. Now I'm going to cover this in a bit more detail in a separate video. This is basically this is the easiest way, but not the best way, because this has no data validation really. But this will work for this simple example. Then, because we are using Pony ORM, This will basically do the commit for us, so we don't need to do any commits. If you're using a different ORM, you might need to do that. When we finish this, we want to return out some information, so we give the user some feedback. So I'm just going to say result, and we'll say the new game. There we go. Or what should we call this? Game instead. Let's call it like that. Now all we're doing is we're sending the data that they've posted, or we're going to post, back to them as a confirmation that it worked. So this is going to work. This should work fine. But what happens if when we actually post more data that has the same game ID, say we post it twice by mistake? Well, it's going to fail because we have this unique is equal to true up here. So we need to do something about that. The easiest way to do that is to have a try in here. So we're basically going to say, let's try to do this like this. If this fails, we'll handle it here with an except. Now, I know that this is a transaction error. I think it's a transaction ORM.transaction integrity error. This is the one that you would get if you try to post something that's already got a unique ID in the database. So I'm going to just handle this error here. We're going to print it out, and then we're going to return just some information back to the user. And we'll just say error game ID already exists. So therefore our program won't crash now if someone tries to post the same game ID again. So let's just sort that out. I'm just going to run this now and check that this is all still good. There we are. So now let's just deal with our get. It's going to be very similar but much easier. We're going to use the ORM session again. So let's copy this here, put it in here. And then what we want to do is we want to access all of the information in our database. And to do that, we need to use select, but I'm going to say items is equal to ORM.select. So this is going to get everything. And to do that, I'm just going to do P for P in game. So this is going to access this table, and it's going to get every object in it and return it to this items variable. But this is now going to be an actual object, so we need to turn that into something that we can actually return, so JSON data. And the easiest way to do that is to turn it into a dictionary. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to return out the result as JSON. So we'll come back here. Let's move that out of the way. And we're going to return this. So we'll just say our result like this, and we're going to create a result variable here. So result is going to be equal to list comprehension. So it's a nice and easy way to do it. And we'll just say i.toDict. So this is what's going to create for I in items. That's just going to create a dictionary representation of all of the each of the items from our database that we can then return out as JSON data here like this. So that's basically it in that instance. So let's run this again, and we're going to go and create a new terminal here. New terminal. I'm going to activate my virtual environment, and I'm going to come across to my testing file that I've created already. This basically just opens up this data CSV. You can see that I've got game ID, home team, away team, and then some scores, and then just loops through that, creates the payload in JSON. Now these are the matching names that we used in the main file, and we're going to match that data up, and we're going to post it to our API like this. So this is running, so let's go ahead and try that, and we'll just do testing.py. So you can see right away that we got all of this information back, and that's because we put into our main py to return the good data that was sent. So this all seems to have worked just fine. And if we look at the response that we got from our actual API, you can see we had all of these post requests that were handled with a 200 all the way through there, and it's handled all of them in under a second, or nice and quick. Great. So let's just check this again. Let's clear this screen. Let's run it again. And you'll see that we get our error. This is the error that we stipulated over here. So we can see that that's working. And you'll see that we still get our post requests as well. And we can also see unique constant failed, our integrity error, which is what we're handling here So that is working great for us. So now we can test out our API. We'll go and grab the URL. Was it localhost 5555? And there we have each one of the pieces of data that we've posted down here. So I think I put 50 pieces in, and you can see that they all have an ID. This is the primary key that Pony created for us, and this is our game ID that we're checking on, along with the teams and the scores. So that is working great. So now we have one endpoint left to create, which is the detail one. This should be pretty straightforward. We're just going to handle the actual query here, and we're just going to handle it with the game ID here. So when we get this GET request, we also need to pass in the game ID, which this is what we're getting from here. So this now matches this, which means we have access to this string. And what we can do then, I'm just going to put a return in here, my API doesn't crash. What we can do is we can then query the database again. So we can do with ORM .db session, we can ask it to find with game.get, and we can look for where the game ID is equal to the game ID that we've been given. So this is searching for this field in our database using the ID that we have given it here that we're going to put into the URL. Then, as we did before, we need to do our toDict, which we had up here, but because we're only going to have one instance returned, we don't need to do the whole list comprehension, and we can just say result is going to be the item.toDict, like this. So let's save that. Let's check our things going to run now. There we go. So let's come back here. Let's grab this game ID. We'll put it in our URL, and we should get that information right back there. What we want to do now, though, is handle if for whatever reason this happens. So we can see that we're searching for a game ID that doesn't exist, and we can see that this has been represented down here. So let's go ahead and just add in our try again. So we'll do try here, and if this fails, we'll do except, and we'll say return error, game does not exist. Let's try that, and let's see now. Game does not exist. There we go. And let's find one. Do I have one saved that does? There we are. So we've handled that a little bit neater now. Not the best way of doing it, but still a working solution. So that is basically it. This is a pretty small basic API. We've got create and read here. We don't have update and delete. We would definitely want to add those in, but I wanted to leave it here just because I think this is quite neat and tidy for those of you that are looking to learn how to make APIs using Python. So if you want to give this a go, I definitely recommend it. Or if you want to try it with just Flask without the extension of Flask-RESTful, with a different ORM, or maybe even something like Fast API, something like this is a great project to start with. If you've enjoyed this video, I think you're going to like this one here where I created another basic minimal API using a slightly different framework.